I sometimes eat ice cream for dessert. I sometimes eat ice cream for dessert. We sometimes go to the beach on weekends. We sometimes go to the beach on weekends. Sometimes I forget to bring my umbrella when it rains. Sometimes I forget to bring my umbrella when it rains. My mom sometimes bakes cookies for us. My mom sometimes bakes cookies for us. I sometimes watch movies late at night. I sometimes watch movies late at night. We sometimes have picnics in the park. We sometimes have picnics in the park. Sometimes I take the bus to school instead of walking. Sometimes I take the bus to school instead of walking. My brother sometimes helps me with my homework. My brother sometimes helps me with my homework. I sometimes read books before going to bed. I sometimes read books before going to bed. We sometimes visit our grandparents on holidays. We sometimes visit our grandparents on holidays. Sometimes I wear my favorite hat to school. Sometimes I wear my favorite hat to school. I sometimes listen to music while doing chores. I sometimes listen to music while doing chores. Sometimes I play soccer with my neighbors. Sometimes I play soccer with my neighbors. We sometimes have family game nights on Saturdays. We sometimes have family game nights on Saturdays. Sometimes I go swimming in the pool. Sometimes I go swimming in the pool. I sometimes eat vegetables with my dinner. I sometimes eat vegetables with my dinner. We sometimes go camping during the summer. We sometimes go camping during the summer. Sometimes I play the piano for fun. Sometimes I play the piano for fun. My dad sometimes barbecues on weekends. My dad sometimes barbecues on weekends. I sometimes ride my bike to the park. I sometimes ride my bike to the park. We sometimes have movie nights at home. We sometimes have movie nights at home. Sometimes I forget where I put my keys. Sometimes I forget where I put my keys. I sometimes draw pictures in my free time. I sometimes draw pictures in my free time. We sometimes go on hikes in the mountains. We sometimes go on hikes in the mountains. Sometimes I wear my favorite t-shirt to school. Sometimes I wear my favorite t-shirt to school. I sometimes help my mom with cooking. I sometimes help my mom with cooking. We sometimes visit the zoo on weekends. We sometimes visit the zoo on weekends. Sometimes I take photos of beautiful sunsets. Sometimes I take photos of beautiful sunsets. I sometimes write stories in my journal. I sometimes write stories in my journal. Sometimes I go shopping with my friends. Sometimes I go shopping with my friends. I sometimes eat sandwiches for lunch. I sometimes eat sandwiches for lunch. We sometimes have barbecues in the backyard. We sometimes have barbecues in the backyard. Sometimes I watch cartoons on TV. Sometimes I watch cartoons on TV. My sister sometimes plays the guitar for us. My sister sometimes plays the guitar for us. I sometimes visit the library to borrow books. I sometimes visit the library to borrow books. We sometimes have sleepovers with our cousins. We sometimes have sleepovers with our cousins. Sometimes I lose track of time while reading. Sometimes I lose track of time while reading. I sometimes ride my skateboard in the park. I sometimes ride my skateboard in the park. We sometimes go to the movies on Fridays. We sometimes go to the movies on Fridays. Sometimes I wear a hat to protect myself from the sun. Sometimes I wear a hat to protect myself from the sun. I sometimes help my dad with gardening. I sometimes help my dad with gardening. We sometimes go on road trips during vacations. We sometimes go on road trips during vacations. Sometimes I collect seashells at the beach. Sometimes I collect seashells at the beach. I sometimes write letters to my pen pal. I sometimes write letters to my pen pal. Sometimes I go to the gym to exercise. Sometimes I go to the gym to exercise. I sometimes eat pizza for dinner. I sometimes eat pizza for dinner. We sometimes have picnics by the lake. We sometimes have picnics by the lake. Sometimes I watch my favorite TV show. Sometimes I watch my favorite TV show. My brother sometimes plays soccer with his friends. My brother sometimes plays soccer with his friends. I sometimes visit the museum to see art. I sometimes visit the museum to see art. We sometimes have game nights with our neighbors. We sometimes have game nights with our neighbors. Sometimes I misplace my sunglasses. Sometimes I misplace my sunglasses. I sometimes draw pictures of animals. I sometimes draw pictures of animals. We sometimes go camping in the mountains. We sometimes go camping in the mountains. Sometimes I wear a dress for special occasion. Sometimes I wear a dress for special occasion. I sometimes help my sister with her homework. I sometimes help my sister with her homework. We sometimes visit amusement parks on holidays. We sometimes visit amusement parks on holidays. Sometimes I take selfies with my friends. Sometimes I take selfies with my friends. I sometimes write poems in my notebook. I sometimes write poems in my notebook. Sometimes I go for a jog in the morning. Sometimes I go for a jog in the morning. I sometimes eat fruits for a healthy snack. I sometimes eat fruits for a healthy snack. We sometimes have barbecues at the beach. We sometimes have barbecues at the beach. Sometimes I watch funny videos on the internet. Sometimes I watch funny videos on the internet. My mom sometimes plays the piano for us. My mom sometimes plays the piano for us. I sometimes visit the park to play on the swings. I sometimes visit the park to play on the swings. We sometimes have movie marathons at home. We sometimes have movie marathons at home. Sometimes I forget my phone at home. Sometimes I forget my phone at home. I sometimes paint pictures with watercolors. I sometimes paint pictures with watercolors. We sometimes go on nature walks in the forest. We sometimes go on nature walks in the forest. Sometimes I wear a jacket when it's cold outside. Sometimes I wear a jacket when it's cold outside. I sometimes help my grandparents with chores. I sometimes help my grandparents with chores. We sometimes go on road trips to visit relatives. We sometimes go on road trips to visit relatives. Sometimes I collect stamps from different countries. Sometimes I collect stamps from different countries. I sometimes write in my diary before going to sleep. I sometimes write in my diary before going to sleep. Sometimes I go to the swimming pool to swim. Sometimes I go to the swimming pool to swim. I sometimes eat yogurt for breakfast. I sometimes eat yogurt for breakfast. We sometimes have bonfires in the backyard. We sometimes have bonfires in the backyard. Sometimes I watch animated movies with my siblings. Sometimes I watch animated movies with my siblings. My dad sometimes plays the guitar for us. My dad sometimes plays the guitar for us. I sometimes visit the playground to play on the slides. I sometimes visit the playground to play on the slides. We sometimes have karaoke nights at home. We sometimes have karaoke nights at home. Sometimes I forget to bring my lunch to school. Sometimes I forget to bring my lunch to school. I sometimes create crafts using recycled materials. I sometimes create crafts using recycled materials. We sometimes go on bike rides in the countryside. We sometimes go on bike rides in the countryside. Sometimes I wear a hat to shield myself from the sun. Sometimes I wear a hat to shield myself from the sun. I sometimes help my mom with grocery shopping. I sometimes help my mom with grocery shopping. We sometimes go on weekend trips to nearby cities. We sometimes go on weekend trips to nearby cities. I sometimes write short stories in my spare time. I sometimes write short stories in my spare time. We sometimes have tea parties with our stuffed animals. We sometimes have tea parties with our stuffed animals. Sometimes I go to the park to fly a kite. Sometimes I go to the park to fly a kite. I sometimes eat popcorn while watching movies. I sometimes eat popcorn while watching movies. We sometimes have family barbecues in the backyard. We sometimes have family barbecues in the backyard. Sometimes I watch funny cat videos on the internet. Sometimes I watch funny cat videos on the internet. I sometimes visit the zoo to see the animals. I sometimes visit the zoo to see the animals. We sometimes have picnics in the countryside. We sometimes have picnics in the countryside. Sometimes I forget to turn off the lights when I leave a room. Sometimes I forget to turn off the lights when I leave a room. I sometimes bake cookies with my mom. I sometimes bake cookies with my mom. We sometimes go on long walks in the evening. We sometimes go on long walks in the evening. Sometimes I go to the gym to exercise. Sometimes I go to the gym to exercise. I sometimes eat salad for a healthy lunch. I sometimes eat salad for a healthy lunch. We sometimes have bonfires at the beach. We sometimes have bonfires at the beach. Sometimes I watch documentaries on interesting topics. Sometimes I watch documentaries on interesting topics. My sister sometimes plays the violin for us. My sister sometimes plays the violin for us. I sometimes visit the library to borrow books. I sometimes visit the library to borrow books. We sometimes have game nights with our friends. We sometimes have game nights with our friends. Sometimes I lose my keys and have to search for them. Sometimes I lose my keys and have to search for them. I sometimes draw pictures of landscapes. I sometimes draw pictures of landscapes. We sometimes go on camping trips in the wilderness. We sometimes go on camping trips in the wilderness. Sometimes I wear sunglasses to protect my eyes from the sun. Sometimes I wear sunglasses to protect my eyes from the sun. I sometimes help my dad with household chores. I sometimes help my dad with household chores. We sometimes go on road trips to explore new places. We sometimes go on road trips to explore new places. Sometimes I collect shells from the beach. Sometimes I collect shells from the beach. I sometimes write letters to my favorite author. I sometimes write letters to my favorite author. Sometimes I go for a bike ride in the park. Sometimes I go for a bike ride in the park. I sometimes eat sushi for dinner. I sometimes eat sushi for dinner. We sometimes have picnics in the mountains. We sometimes have picnics in the mountains. Sometimes I watch funny videos on social media. Sometimes I watch funny videos on social media. My mom sometimes plays the flute for us. My mom sometimes plays the flute for us. I sometimes visit the farmer's market to buy fresh produce. I sometimes visit the farmer's market to buy fresh produce. We sometimes have movie nights with our cousins. We sometimes have movie nights with our cousins. Sometimes I forget to water my plants. Sometimes I forget to water my plants. I sometimes paint pictures of flowers. I sometimes paint pictures of flowers. We sometimes go on hiking trips in national parks. We sometimes go on hiking trips in national parks. Sometimes I wear a scarf to stay warm in the winter. Sometimes I wear a scarf to stay warm in the winter. I sometimes help my sibling with their homework. I sometimes help my sibling with their homework. We sometimes go on vacation to different countries. We sometimes go on vacation to different countries. Sometimes I collect postcards from my travels. Sometimes I collect postcards from my travels. I sometimes write poems about nature. I sometimes write poems about nature. Sometimes I go swimming in the river. Sometimes I go swimming in the river. I sometimes eat pancakes for breakfast. I sometimes eat pancakes for breakfast. We sometimes have barbecues in the park. We sometimes have barbecues in the park. Sometimes I watch sports games on TV. Sometimes I watch sports games on TV.